Policeman humiliates black man, then discovers he's the new chief of police and regrets it. Enjoy the story. The fluorescent lights of the Chicago Community Legal Center flickered like dying stars as Marcella Washington gathered her files for the day. Her weathered hands, adorned with simple silver rings that had belonged to her grandmother, carefully stacked case folders, each one representing a family fighting an uphill battle against a system that seemed designed to crush them. The afternoon sun slanted through grimy windows, casting long shadows across her cluttered desk, where coffee-stained papers told stories of evicted tenants, wrongfully terminated workers, and immigrants navigating a maze of bureaucracy. Marcella removed her reading glasses, rubbing her tired eyes. At 52, she carried herself with the quiet dignity of someone who had weathered storms but refused to bow. Her natural hair, silver-streaked and worn in a neat twist, framed a face that spoke of wisdom earned through struggle. She glanced at her reflection in the darkened computer screen and straightened her shoulders. Another day of fighting for the voiceless was done, but her work was far from over. The elevator in her apartment building wheezed and groaned as it climbed to the 7th floor. Marcella stepped into the narrow hallway, her sensible flat silent against worn carpeting. The building wasn't much: peeling paint, flickering hallway, lights, the persistent smell of someone's dinner mixing with industrial cleaning supplies. But it was home. More importantly, it was hers, earned through 27 years of clawing her way up from nothing. Her one-bedroom apartment told the story of a woman who valued substance over style. Law books lined makeshift shelves constructed from boards and bricks. A single framed photograph on her kitchen table showed her with her late mother, both wearing graduation caps. Marcella's law degree ceremony, the proudest day of her mother's short life. The furniture was second-hand but spotless, each piece arranged with the precision of someone who understood that dignity wasn't about what you owned, but how you carried yourself. As she prepared her simple dinner of rice and beans, Marcella's phone buzzed. The caller ID made her stomach tighten. "City Hall, Mayor's office," she answered with professional composure, though her heart hammered against her ribs. "Ms. Washington? This is Sandra Mills, the Mayor's Chief of Staff. Mayor Henderson would like to meet with you tomorrow morning at 9. It's regarding a position we discussed several months ago." The woman's voice carried an odd mixture of formality and excitement. "I trust you remember our conversation about the Police Oversight Commission?" Marcella's hand trembled slightly as she set down her fork. She remembered every word of that conversation, how the mayor had sought her out after her work exposing corruption in the housing authority, how he'd mentioned restructuring police accountability, how she dared to hope that real change might be possible. "Yes, I remember. I'll be there." The next morning arrived grey and drizzling, Chicago's autumn sky the color of old steel. Marcella stood before her small bathroom mirror, adjusting the collar of her best suit, a navy blue ensemble she'd bought 3 years ago for court appearances. The fabric was beginning to show wear at the elbows, but it still fit her strong frame well. She applied minimal makeup with practiced efficiency, her movements betraying none of the nervous energy coursing through her veins. City Hall loomed before her like a fortress of limestone and bureaucracy. Marcella climbed the wide steps, her heels clicking against wet stone, past protesters with signs demanding police reform and counter-protesters calling for law and order. The marble lobby echoed with the whispered conversations of people who moved in circles of power she'd only observed from the outside. Mayor Henderson's office was everything she'd expected: rich mahogany, leather-bound books that looked more decorative than functional, and windows that offered a commanding view of the city she'd spent her career trying to heal one case at a time. The mayor, a tall man with silver temples and the kind of confident smile that won elections, rose from behind his imposing desk. "Marcella, thank you for coming." His handshake was firm, his eyes direct. "I'll get straight to the point. The city is facing a crisis of confidence in our police department. We need someone with your integrity, your experience, and your community connections to lead real reform." He gestured to a chair across from his desk. "I'm offering you the position of Chief of Police." The words hung in the air like smoke. Marcella felt the floor shift beneath her feet, though she maintained her composed exterior. "Chief of Police." Her voice remained steady despite the earthquake in her chest. "Mr. Mayor, I appreciate your confidence, but I've never been a police officer. I've spent my career advocating for those the police have failed." "Exactly." Henderson leaned forward, his expression intense. "We need an outsider, someone the community trusts, someone who can't be accused of protecting the old guard. Your law enforcement will come from civilian oversight, your authority from the trust you've built. The City Council has already approved the restructuring that would allow this appointment. Marcella's mind raced through the implications. Every case she'd handled involving police misconduct, every family she'd counseled after losing a loved one to excessive force, every time she'd watched officers close ranks to protect their own, all of it had led to this moment. She thought of her mother's photograph on her kitchen table, of the promise she'd made at that small graveside to use her education to make a difference. "When would you need an answer?" she asked, though part of her already knew. "The announcement goes out this afternoon. The swearing-in ceremony is scheduled for next Monday." Henderson's smile was confident, as if he'd never doubted her response. "Marcella, you have the chance to transform this department from the inside, to be the change everyone talks about, but no one thinks is possible. But what happens when the system you're meant to reform discovers your true identity before you've had a chance to prove yourself?" The weekend passed in a blur of phone calls, consultations with trusted colleagues, and sleepless nights spent staring at her ceiling, trying to reconcile the magnitude of what lay ahead. Marcella had built her career on being the voice for those who couldn't speak for themselves. Now she would have to become the authority figure she'd spent decades holding accountable. Monday morning arrived with unseasonable warmth, as if the city itself was holding its breath. Marcella stood in her bedroom, looking at the police uniform hanging from her closet door. The navy blue fabric was crisp, new, the brass buttons gleaming. On the dresser lay the chief's badge, a shield of authority she'd never imagined wearing. The swearing-in ceremony was private, attended only by the mayor, a handful of city officials, and one photographer to document the historic moment. As Judge Patricia Calloway administered the oath, Marcella felt the weight of history settling on her shoulders. She was the first civilian, the first African-American woman, the first outsider to hold this position in the department's 150-year history. "Do you solemnly swear to uphold the laws of this city and state, to protect and serve all citizens with equal justice and dignity?" Judge Calloway's voice echoed in the small chamber. "I do," Marcella replied, her voice carrying the conviction of someone who understood that words were promises, and promises were sacred. The photographer's flash captured the moment. The first black woman to lead the Chicago Police Department, her hand still raised, her expression solemn with the weight of responsibility. But what that photograph couldn't capture was the phone call that would come that very afternoon, the one that would threaten everything before she'd even had a chance to prove herself. The call came at 3:47 p.m., just as Marcella was leaving, her final consultation meeting with a family whose teenage son had been killed in a police shooting. The irony wasn't lost on her. She was transitioning from advocate to authority, but the pain in that mother's eyes remained the same. "Chief Washington?" The voice was crisp, professional, but carried an undertone of barely contained hostility. "This is Deputy Chief Morrison. We need to talk. There's been a development." 20 minutes later, Marcella sat across from Deputy Chief Thomas Morrison in what would soon be her office. Morrison was everything Central Casting would order for a career cop. Square jaw, steel grey hair, eyes that had seen too much and trusted too little. His uniform was immaculate, his posture rigid with decades of military-style discipline. "I'll be direct, Chief." The title dripped from his tongue like an accusation. "Half the force is talking about walking out. You're an outsider. You've never walked a beat. You've never had someone shoot at you in a dark alley." He leaned forward, his voice dropping to a growl. "And frankly, some of them are questioning whether someone who's spent her career suing cops can really lead cops." Marcella met his gaze without flinching. "And what do you think, Deputy Chief?" Morrison was quiet for a long moment, studying her with the intensity of someone trying to solve a puzzle. "I think you're about to find out that being a critic is a hell of a lot easier than being responsible for 8,000 officers and the safety of 3 million people." The weeks that followed were a masterclass in institutional resistance. Officers who should have been providing briefings suddenly had scheduling conflicts. Reports that should have reached her desk got lost in bureaucratic maze. Squad room. Conversations stopped when she entered, replaced by watchful silence and barely concealed hostility. Marcella established herself in the chief's office, a corner room on the 4th floor of police headquarters, with windows that overlooked the city she'd sworn to protect. She spent long hours studying departmental procedures, crime statistics and officer records, searching for patterns and solutions. Her door remained open, though few took advantage of the invitation to visit. But it was the small acts of defiance that cut deepest. The security guard who took just a moment too long to buzz her through doors, the elevator that seemed to always be out of order when she approached, the reports that were submitted with barely concealed contempt following the letter of regulations while violating their spirit entirely. Have you ever walked into a room and felt the weight of everyone's expectations, their doubts, their hope that you'll fail? Drop a comment below. 3 weeks into her tenure, the first real test came at 2:17 a.m. on a Tuesday. Marcella's phone shattered the silence of her bedroom with its insistent ringing. Officer-involved shooting on the south side. Suspect deceased. Community gathering. Situation volatile. She arrived at the scene to find flashing lights painting the night in harsh reds and blues, angry voices raised above the yellow tape, and television news crews already setting up their cameras. The deceased was Marcus Thompson, 19 years, old shot, while allegedly reaching for a weapon that turned out to be a cell phone. Commander Sarah Chen, a 20-year veteran with intelligent eyes and prematurely grey hair, briefed Marcella with clinical precision. 2 officers responded to a call about suspicious activity. Subject matched description of armed robbery suspect from last week. When ordered to show his hands, subject allegedly reached into his jacket pocket. Officers perceived threat and responded with deadly force. Marcella studied the scene, noting the distance between where Marcus had fallen and the nearest streetlight, the angle of the police cars, the gathering crowd of neighbors whose faces showed a mixture of grief and rage she knew all too well. This was exactly the kind of incident that had shaped her career from the other side. "Where are the officers now?" she asked. "Administrative. Leave standard procedure," Chen replied. "Union rep is already talking about justified response to perceived threat." But what Commander Chen didn't tell her was that one of those officers, the one who'd pulled the trigger, had a history. That would soon change everything Marcella thought she knew about the challenge ahead. The community meeting the next evening filled Mount Olive Baptist Church to capacity, the same church where Marcella's mother had taken her every Sunday until cancer claimed her voice mid-sermon one October morning 15 years ago. Reverend Williams, now silver-haired but still possessed of a voice that could shake foundations, introduced her to a crowd crackling with tension and grief. Marcella stepped to the podium and looked out at faces that mirrored her own. Working people, grandmothers who'd raised children in these streets, fathers who worked double shifts to keep families together, young people whose eyes held too much, knowledge of how the world could crush dreams. Some wore T-shirts with Marcus Thompson's picture. Others held signs demanding justice. "I know why you're here," she began, her voice carrying clearly to the back of the sanctuary. "You're here because another young man is dead. And you want answers. You want justice. You want change." She paused, letting the silence settle. "So do I." A woman in the third row stood up, tears streaming down her face. "My boy Marcus wasn't no criminal. He was working 2 jobs trying to save money for community college. He was walking home from the bus stop." Her voice broke. "How do you sleep at night, knowing your officers killed an innocent child?" The question hung in the air like a physical weight. Marcella had spent her career asking similar questions, demanding accountability from officials who offered nothing but bureaucratic deflection. Now she stood on the other side, representing the very system she'd fought against. "I don't sleep well," Marcella replied quietly, "and I won't sleep well until we have answers, until we have accountability, until we have the changes that prevent another mother from standing up in this church with a broken heart." But even as she spoke those words, she wondered if change was possible from within a system designed to protect itself, or if she'd simply become another face of the same institutional indifference she'd once battled. The investigation into Marcus Thompson's death revealed what Marcella had suspected, but hoped she wouldn't find. Officer Jake Sullivan, the shooter, had 3 prior incidents involving excessive force, each one buried in personnel files and departmental politics. His partner, Officer Rodriguez, had filed a report expressing concerns about Sullivan's judgment just 2 months earlier, a report that had somehow never reached supervisory attention. Marcella called Sullivan into her office on a Thursday afternoon, the autumn light filtering through her windows, casting long shadows across the room. Sullivan entered with the swagger of someone who'd never faced real consequences for his actions, his uniform crisp, his badge polished to a shine that reflected his certainty that this meeting would end like all the others. with administrative theater and no real accountability. Officer Sullivan, Marcella began, gesturing to the chair across from her desk. Let's talk about Marcus Thompson. Sullivan's jaw tightened, but his voice remained steady. I responded to a perceived threat according to department protocols. Subject matched description of armed suspect, failed to comply with orders, reached for what appeared to be a weapon. My actions were justified under current use of force guidelines. The words came out like a well-rehearsed script, which they probably were. Marcella had heard similar justifications countless times from the other side of her legal practice. But now, wearing the badge, she felt the full weight of how those words sounded to families like Marcus Thompson's. Tell me about the other incidents, she said quietly. The grandmother who filed a complaint after you threw her teenage grandson against a car for suspicious walking. The college student who ended up in the hospital after what your report called resisting arrest. The pattern that somehow never quite reached the threshold for discipline. Sullivan's confident facade cracked slightly. I've been cleared in all previous investigations. My record speaks for itself. Yes, it does, Marcella agreed. It speaks to a system that protects officers at the expense of the community they're sworn to serve. But what Sullivan didn't know was that his pattern of behavior was about to intersect with Marcella's past in a way that would force her to confront the true cost of the badge she now wore. The call came on a Saturday evening, as Marcella sat in her small kitchen, reading case files over a dinner of leftover Chinese takeout. The voice on the other end was shaky, desperate, familiar in a way that made her stomach drop. Ms. Washington, this is Elena Rodriguez, Officer Rodriguez's wife. I need your help. Marcella set down her chopsticks, her full attention focused on the trembling voice. Elena Rodriguez had been one of her clients 3 years ago when her landlord had tried to evict her family through fraudulent lease violations, a quiet woman who cleaned office buildings at night to support her husband's police academy dreams and their 2 young daughters. Elena, what's wrong? It's about my husband, about what happened with that boy, Marcus Thompson. Elena's voice dropped to a whisper as if she feared being overheard. Miguel didn't want to be there that night. He tried to talk Jake down, tried to de-escalate, but Jake just shot. And now they're saying Miguel should back up Jake's story, that it's about brotherhood, about protecting each other. The implications hit Marcella like a physical blow. Officer Rodriguez, Miguel, the partner who'd been present during Marcus Thompson's death, was married to a woman Marcella had helped save from homelessness. The personal and professional were colliding in ways that made her head spin. Elena, where are you calling from? A payphone outside a grocery store. I'm scared to use my house phone. Elena's voice cracked. Miguel is a good man, Ms. Washington. You helped our family when no one else would. But he's being pressured to lie, to say things happened differently than they did. And if he doesn't, what? They'll destroy his career. We'll lose everything. But if he does lie, that boy's family will never get justice, and Miguel will never forgive himself. Marcella closed her eyes, feeling the weight of impossible choices settling on her shoulders. Elena and Miguel Rodriguez represented everything she'd fought for as a lawyer. Working families trying to build decent lives, immigrants pursuing the American dream through sacrifice and integrity. But now Miguel's testimony could be the key to holding Jake Sullivan accountable for Marcus Thompson's death. Elena, can Miguel come see me? Privately? Off the record? He's scared. The other officers, they're watching him, making sure he stays in line. Elena paused, her breathing audible over the static connection. But I'll ask him, because you helped us once when we had nowhere else to turn. As Marcella hung up the phone, she realized that the case that would define her tenure as chief was about to become intensely personal, forcing her to navigate not just institutional politics, but the loyalty of people whose lives she'd touched long before she ever wore a badge. Miguel Rodriguez appeared at Marcella's apartment building the next evening, arriving like a shadow slipping through the lobby when the security guard was distracted. He knocked softly on her door, and when she opened it, she saw a man wrestling with his conscience. Still young, with kind eyes and the bearing of someone who'd joined the force to make a difference, he looked exhausted, haunted. Ms. Washington, he said quietly, glancing down the hallway as if expecting to see surveillance. Eleanor said you wanted to talk. Marcella invited him in, offering coffee he declined with shaking hands. They sat at her small kitchen table, the same table where she'd counseled his wife 3 years ago, where she'd helped Elena understand tenant rights and draft the letters that saved their family from eviction. Miguel, tell me what really happened. That night, the story that emerged was both better and worse than Marcela had imagined. Miguel Rodriguez had indeed tried to de-escalate the situation. He'd recognized that Marcus Thompson was scared, not threatening, that the teenager's movement suggested confusion rather than aggression. He'd called out to his partner to wait, to assess, to give the young man a chance to comply. But Jake, he was already amped up, Miguel said, his voice barely above a whisper. He'd been talking all week about how tired he was of these people, thinking they could disrespect police. When Marcus reached for his phone to call his mother, to tell her he was being stopped, Jake saw what he wanted to see. And after the shooting, Miguel's shoulders sagged. Jake told me it was us against them now, that if I didn't back his story about perceived threats and non-compliance, we'd both go down. That my family would lose everything. That I'd be blacklisted from every police department in the state. He looked up at Marcela with eyes full of anguish. But I can't sleep. I see that boy's face every night. I hear his mother crying at the scene. Marcela reached across the table, covering his trembling hand with her own. Miguel, I can't make this choice for you, but I can tell you that integrity isn't just about doing the right thing when it's easy. It's about doing the right thing when everything you've worked for hangs in the balance. What if I testify truthfully and they destroy my career? What happens to Eleanor and the girls? What happens to your daughters if they grow up knowing their father chose loyalty to a corrupt system over justice for a murdered teenager? Miguel was quiet for a long time, staring at his hands. When he finally looked up, Marcela saw the moment when he made his choice. Not the easy one, but the right one. But neither of them could have predicted how that choice would set in. Motion events that would shake the entire department and force Marcela to confront the true limits of her authority. The internal affairs investigation into Marcus Thompson's death took a dramatic turn when Miguel Rodriguez formally recanted his initial statement and provided testimony that contradicted Officer Sullivan's account. Word of his cooperation spread through the department like wildfire, and Marcela found herself navigating not just a criminal investigation, but a crisis of loyalty and retribution within her own ranks. Sullivan was placed on unpaid administrative leave pending the investigation, a decision that sparked the first direct challenge to Marcela's authority. Deputy Chief Morrison requested a private meeting, arriving at her office with 3 other senior commanders in what felt more like a confrontation than a consultation. Chief, the rank and file are concerned about the message we're sending, Morrison began, his tone carefully controlled, but edged with frustration. Rodriguez broke the blue line, violated the trust that keeps officers alive on the street. And now we're rewarding that betrayal? Commander Chen, who'd briefed Marcela at the scene, leaned forward. Officers need to know that their partners have their backs, especially in split-second decisions. If we start second-guessing every use of force, if we encourage officers to turn on each other, we'll have chaos. Marcela listened to their concerns, understanding the institutional logic even as she rejected its moral foundation. Let me be clear, she said finally. We don't have brotherhood in this department. We have accountability. We don't have loyalty to officers who abuse their authority. We have loyalty to the oath we all swore to protect and serve. The room fell silent. Morrison's jaw worked as if he were chewing on words too dangerous to speak. Finally he stood. Chief, I hope you understand what you're asking us to do. You're asking us to change everything this department has been built on. Yes, Marcela replied without hesitation. I am. But what she didn't anticipate was how the Union would respond, or how their response would test not just her authority, but her ability to protect the officers who chose truth over loyalty. The Fraternal Order of Police held an emergency meeting the following Tuesday, and by Wednesday morning Marcela faced the first vote of no confidence in the department's modern history. The Union president, a veteran sergeant named Danny Walsh, with the build of a linebacker and the political instincts of a ward boss, called a press conference on the steps of City Hall. Chief Washington has proven that she doesn't understand police work and doesn't support the men and women who risk their lives every day, Walsh declared to a crowd of reporters and uniformed officers. Her persecution of Officer Sullivan and her encouragement of officers to betray their partners has created a crisis of leadership that threatens public safety. The camera crews that had documented her swearing-in ceremony now captured images of her walking through a gauntlet of hostile stares and turned backs as she entered headquarters each morning. Someone had placed a stack of resignation forms on her desk with a note, "In case you want to do the right thing." But the real test came that Thursday afternoon when Miguel Rodriguez's car was vandalized in the precinct parking lot. Windows smashed, tires slashed. The word traitor spray-painted across the hood in red letters that looked like blood. Miguel called in sick the next day, and Elena called Marcela in tears. "They're trying to break him," Elena sobbed into the phone. "Miguel won't say it, but he's scared. We're all scared." Marcela stared out her office window at the city she'd sworn to protect, wondering if she'd made a terrible mistake in accepting a position that seemed to require her to choose between justice and the safety of those brave enough to seek it. But then she thought of Marcus Thompson's mother, of all the families she'd counseled over the years, of the promise she'd made to her own mother's memory. That evening she made a decision that would either establish her authority once, and for all her end her tenure, as the shortest-serving police chief in the department's history. Friday morning, Marcela called an all-hands meeting in the department's main assembly hall, a cavernous room that hadn't been used for a general gathering in over a decade. Word spread quickly through the ranks. The chief was going to address. The entire force and attendance was mandatory. Officers filed in with expressions ranging from curious to hostile to openly contemptuous. Some wore their union pins prominently displayed. Others had modified their uniforms in small acts of defiance. Buttons slightly askew, ties loosened just enough to show disrespect without crossing into insubordination. Marcela stood at the podium, looking out at 800 faces, feeling the weight of their collective skepticism and anger. "3 months ago, I stood in this building and swore an oath," she began, her voice carrying clearly to the back of the hall. "I swore to protect and serve all citizens with equal justice and dignity. Not just the citizens who look like us, not just the ones who live in the right neighborhoods, not just the ones who don't challenge our authority, all citizens." A murmur rippled through the crowd, but she continued without pause. "You think I don't understand police work because I've never walked a beat, but I understand something else. I understand what it's like to be on the other side of that badge when it's worn by someone who's forgotten that their authority comes from the community they serve, not from the uniform they wear." The murmur grew louder, more agitated. Someone in the back called out, "We don't need lectures from a civilian." Marcela stopped speaking, letting the silence stretch until the room was completely quiet. Then she did something no police chief had ever done in that hall. She began to tell them about her own encounters with officers who'd forgotten their oath. "When I was 16 years old, walking home from my job at the corner grocery store, an officer stopped me and asked what I was doing in his neighborhood. When I was 25, fresh out of law school, an officer pulled me over and told me my car was too nice for someone like me to afford legally. When I was 38, trying to help a client who'd been beaten during an arrest, an officer told me that people like me were the reason good cops couldn't do their jobs." The room was dead silent now, every officer focused on her words, with an intensity she hadn't seen since her first day. "But I also remember Officer Janet Morales, who walked me home when I was 14, and being followed by older boys who thought a girl with books was fair game. I remember Sergeant Mike O'Brien, who sat with my mother in the emergency room when she collapsed at the bus stop and stayed until I could get there from work. I remember Detective Lisa Park, who worked my neighbor's murder case for 2 years without pay because she believed every victim deserved justice, regardless of their address." She paused, scanning the faces before her, seeing the first signs that some were actually listening rather than just waiting for their turn to judge. "The badge doesn't make you a good cop or a bad cop. The choices you make while wearing it do, and every single day, you choose whether you're going to be someone's Officer Morales or someone's nightmare story." But even as she spoke those words, Marcela knew that changing hearts and minds would require more than speeches. It would require her to prove that she was willing to back up her words with action, regardless of the personal cost. The weeks following Marcela's address to the force brought subtle but measurable changes. Miguel Rodriguez returned to duty with a security detail quietly arranged by Commander Chen, who'd begun to see the chief's vision for what the department could become. Officer Sullivan's case moved through the system with unprecedented transparency. The investigation findings made public, despite union objections. But the real transformation began with smaller changes that rippled outward like stones dropped. In Stillwater, Marcela instituted community forums where citizens could speak directly to precinct commanders about their concerns. She required all officers to complete bias training conducted by community organizations rather than department instructors. Most controversially, She established a civilian review board with real authority to investigate complaints and recommend disciplinary action. The resistance was fierce and constant. Anonymous flyers appeared on car windshields outside community meetings, questioning Marcella's loyalty to law enforcement. Social media accounts spread rumors about her past cases, twisting her advocacy for civil rights into evidence of anti-police bias. Someone leaked her home address to right-wing websites, forcing her to accept a security detail she'd initially refused. Yet something else was happening too, something the critics couldn't explain away. Crime rates in neighborhoods with the most intensive community policing reforms were dropping. Citizen complaints decreased by 30% in precincts where commanders embraced the new protocols. Young officers, particularly those from diverse backgrounds, began requesting transfers into units that emphasized de-escalation and community engagement. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Officer Rodriguez's testimony in Sullivan's criminal trial became a catalyst for other officers to come forward with their own stories of institutional pressure to remain silent about misconduct. One by one, a handful of officers began speaking truthfully about what they'd witnessed, what they'd been told to ignore, what they'd been afraid to report. Marcella established a confidential reporting system that bypassed traditional command structure, allowing officers to report misconduct directly to her office without fear of retaliation from supervisors. The first month brought 12 reports. The second month brought 37. By the third month, the floodgates had opened, revealing the scope of the culture of silence she was working to dismantle. But success brought new challenges, and the most difficult test of her leadership was still ahead, one that would force her to choose between protecting the reforms she'd fought to implement and protecting the career that had given her the platform to fight. The crisis that would define Marcella's legacy began on a cold February morning with a phone call from Mayor Henderson. His voice carried a tension she'd never heard before, the careful control of a politician facing a problem that threatened everything he'd worked to build. "Marcella, we need to meet now and bring your attorney." An hour later, she sat in the mayor's private conference room, facing not just Henderson, but the city's legal counsel, the chairman of the city council's public safety committee, and a woman she didn't recognize but whose expensive suit and predatory expression screamed federal prosecutor. "Chief Washington," the unknown woman began, "I'm Assistant United States Attorney Sarah Morrison. We're investigating potential civil rights violations by the Chicago Police Department, specifically allegations of a pattern of excessive force and cover-ups dating back 15 years. Marcella's stomach dropped, but she kept her expression. "Neutral. What does this have to do with my administration? These allegations predate my tenure by over a decade." "True," Morrison replied with a thin smile. "But our investigation has uncovered evidence that some of the most damaging cover-ups occurred in cases where you served as plaintiff's attorney, cases where you negotiated settlements that included non-disclosure agreements that prevented your clients from cooperating with federal investigators." The accusation hung in the air like smoke. Marcella felt the walls of the conference room closing in as she realized the trap that had been carefully constructed around her. Every settlement she'd negotiated to get justice for her clients, every confidentiality agreement she'd signed to protect families from retaliation, every compromise she'd made working within a broken system, all of it was now being weaponized against her. "I represented my clients' interests within the legal framework available to me," she said carefully. "Every settlement was approved by the families involved, and every agreement was designed to provide them with compensation and some measure of closure. But in doing so," Morrison continued, "you may have inadvertently participated in the very cover-up culture you're now claiming to reform. How can the federal government trust that you're committed to transparency when your own career was built on negotiating silence?" Mayor Henderson's face had gone pale. She could see him calculating political costs, measuring her value against the potential damage of a federal investigation. The chairman of the Public Safety Committee was already mentally drafting the press release that would call for her resignation. But what none of them could have anticipated was how Marcella would respond when faced with the choice between her career and her principles, a choice that would reveal the true measure of the woman who dared to believe she could change a system from within. Marcella Washington sat in her office that evening, the city lights of Chicago spreading out below her like a constellation of possibilities and broken dreams. On her desk lay 3 documents: her letter of resignation, already drafted but not yet signed, the federal subpoena demanding all records related to her previous cases, and a handwritten note from Elena Rodriguez thanking her for giving Miguel the courage to tell the truth. The mathematics of survival was simple enough. She could resign, citing personal reasons or the need to focus on family, and disappear back into private practice. The federal investigation would continue without her, but she'd be safely removed from its scope. Her reputation would survive, her future would remain intact, and someone else would inherit the impossible task of reforming the Chicago Police Department. Or she could fight, knowing that the battle would likely destroy her career, that every case she'd ever handled would be scrutinized by hostile investigators looking for evidence of complicity with the very system she'd spent her tenure trying to reform. The irony was suffocating. Her success as an advocate was being used to undermine her authority as a reformer. But as she sat in the gathering darkness, Marcella found herself thinking not about career calculations or political survival, but about Marcus Thompson's mother standing in that church sanctuary, demanding answers that had never come. About Miguel Rodriguez choosing truth over safety. About Officer Morales walking a scared teenager home in the dark. She thought about her own mother, who'd cleaned office buildings at night so her daughter could attend law school during the day, who died believing that education was the key to changing an unjust world. What would that woman think of a daughter who abandoned the fight when it became personally costly? At 11:47 p.m., Marcella made 2 phone calls. The first was to her attorney, instructing him to prepare for a protracted legal battle that would require complete transparency about her past cases, regardless of previous confidentiality agreements. The second was to Assistant U.S. Attorney Morrison, requesting a meeting to discuss full cooperation with the federal investigation. "Ms. Morrison," she said when the prosecutor answered her direct line, "this is Chief Washington. I want to make something clear. I'm not going anywhere, and I'm not hiding behind lawyer games or political cover. If you want to investigate how the system has failed this city, I'll help you do it. But we're going to do it the right way, with full transparency and real accountability." Morrison's surprise was audible in her silence before she responded. "Chief, I'm not sure you understand the implications of what you're suggesting. Full cooperation could expose you to significant legal and professional liability." "I understand perfectly," Marcella replied, "but I also understand that you can't reform a system by protecting the very secrecy that allowed it to become corrupt in the first place." The federal investigation that followed became a masterclass in institutional transformation. Marcella opened every file, waived every privilege, and convinced dozens of her former clients to speak publicly about cases that had been buried under legal settlements and bureaucratic indifference. The process was brutal. Months of depositions, leaked documents and media coverage that portrayed her alternately as a crusading reformer and a collaborator in the very corruption she claimed to oppose. But something unprecedented happened during those months of scrutiny. The investigation that had been designed to destroy her credibility instead revealed the impossible position she'd faced as a civil rights attorney, forced to choose between getting some justice for her clients through flawed settlements or getting no justice at all through a system designed to protect itself. More importantly, her willingness to sacrifice her own career for the sake of transparency began to shift. The narrative within the department. Officers who'd initially seen her as an outsider began to understand that she was willing to pay the same price she was asking of them, the price of choosing integrity over self-preservation. The turning point came during a particularly brutal cross-examination by Morrison's team, broadcast live on local television. For 3 hours, federal prosecutors grilled Marcella about every compromise she'd made, every settlement she'd negotiated, every time she'd chosen pragmatic progress over perfect justice. "Ms. Washington," Morrison said during the final hour, "isn't it true that you participated in a system of cover-ups and silence that enabled the very police misconduct you now claim to be fighting?" Marcella was quiet for a long moment, looking out at the gallery filled with reporters, police officers, community activists and families she'd represented over the years. When she finally spoke, her voice was steady but weighted with the exhaustion of someone who'd spent months defending choices made in impossible circumstances. "Yes," she said simply, "I did participate in that system. Every civil rights attorney in this city has participated in that system because it was the only system available to us. We could negotiate settlements that gave our clients some compensation and some small measure of dignity, or we could watch them get nothing while the officers who hurt them faced no consequences at all. She paused, making eye contact with Morrison. But here's what I learned from all those years of fighting for crumbs instead of justice. The system doesn't reform itself. It has to be forced to change by people willing to pay the price of that change, and I'm willing to pay that price. The federal investigation concluded 6 months later with a consent decree that placed the Chicago Police Department under federal oversight for 5 years. Marcella's career survived, but barely, scarred by months of public scrutiny, and forever changed by the knowledge that reform required not just good intentions, but the willingness to sacrifice everything for the possibility of real change. But the most significant transformation wasn't in policies or procedures, it was in the culture of the department itself. Officer Rodriguez was promoted to sergeant and became a trainer in de-escalation techniques. Commander Chen was appointed deputy chief and tasked with implementing the consent decree reforms. Even some of the officers who'd initially opposed Marcella began to see that accountability didn't mean abandonment. It meant holding themselves and their colleagues to the standard the community deserved. The Sullivan case became a watershed moment. He was convicted of voluntary manslaughter and sentenced to 8 years in prison, the first Chicago police officer to face serious consequences for an unjustified shooting in over a decade. His conviction sent a clear message that the culture of impunity was ending, but it also forced the department to confront the systematic failures that had enabled his misconduct for years. 3 years later, Marcella stood once again at the podium in Mount Olive Baptist Church, but this time the atmosphere was different. Marcus Thompson's mother sat in the front row, no longer alone in her grief but surrounded by other families who'd found justice through a system that had finally begun to take their pain seriously. Change is slow, Marcella told the packed sanctuary. It's frustrating, it's incomplete, and it costs more than any of us want to pay. But it's possible, not because the system suddenly decided to be just, but because people like Miguel Rodriguez chose truth over safety, because families like the Thompsons refused to let their children's deaths be meaningless, because communities, like this one, demanded more than promises. She looked out at the faces before her, police officers sitting next to community activists, teenagers who'd grown up fearing authority, learning to see it as something they might one day be worthy to wield themselves, grandmothers who'd buried too many young men, finally believing that things could be different. "The badge doesn't make you good or bad," she said, echoing words she'd spoken in that same church years earlier, "but it gives you the power to choose who you're going to be every single day. And every day, you have the chance to be someone's reason to believe that justice is possible." As Marcella walked down the church steps that evening, she thought about the journey that had brought her from advocate to authority, from outsider to insider, from someone who fought the system to someone responsible for changing it from within. The work was far from over. It would never be over. But for the first time in years, she believed that progress was possible. The city lights spread out before her like a promise that hadn't been broken, only delayed. And in her pocket, alongside her badge and her keys, she carried a photograph of her mother in her graduation cap, a reminder that sometimes the most important changes happen not because they're easy, but because they're necessary. Real change doesn't come from perfect people making perfect choices. It comes from flawed people deciding that integrity matters more than safety, that truth matters more than comfort, and that the possibility of justice is worth whatever price we have to pay to achieve it. Every day, we have the choice to be someone's reason to believe in tomorrow. What choice will you make? You are amazing. If you genuinely enjoyed this story, please leave a like and subscribe. It's a great feedback for me. If it made you feel seen, heard, or simply reminded, you that change is still possible, share it with someone who needs a little hope today. See you.